Welcome back, all. Dr. JC here, week 6, lecture 6. We're going to do this in 3 parts. We're going to talk more broadly about nationalism in the 19th century, Europe specifically. Last week we talked a little bit about some of those events that took place in the Americas. Now we're going to talk about events that take place here in Europe during the same time period. In this first part here, we're going to talk about this Congress of Vienna, this Congress that's going to get together at the end of Napoleonic reign and rule, and how this Congress of Vienna, reacting to what took place during the Napoleonic Wars, perhaps set the stages for revolutions in 1830 and 1848. So in this first part, we're going to talk about the Congress of Vienna and the revolutions of 1830 and 1848. In part 2, we'll talk a little bit about these emerging isms in the 19th century. Conservatism, liberalism, romanticism. So we'll talk a little bit about those isms and how they impact modern thought and the modern world. And then in the third part, we're going to talk specifically about unification movements that take place in Italy and Germany. I mentioned that at the very end of lecture 5, so that'll be part 3. So in 3 parts here, we're going to talk more broadly about nationalism in 19th century Europe. So let's start with the Napoleonic era and the Congress of Vienna. I want to hearken everyone back to a discussion we had before about the Battle of Leipzig. That's when Napoleon was first defeated on the battlefield in a major way. That was in 1813. In 1814, he was forced to surrender. He surrendered to the British, Lord Castlereagh, the Austrians, Prince Clemens von Metternich, the Prussians, von Hardenberg, and the Russians, Tsar Alexander. And to mock him, they sent him to the island of Elba. You may recall that. And then, of course, Napoleon flees Elba, heads to the south of France, and his famed 100 Days is on. And 100 days later, at the Battle of Waterloo, he's defeated again, and this time sent way the hell down into the South Atlantic and in the island of St. Helena. Well, during that entire time period, this Congress of Vienna was meeting. This Congress of Vienna, also known as the Dancing Congress, and it gets its name largely because most all European leaders, it didn't matter the size of the state. You could be from a very small, geographically recognized state or region to the largest of empires like Russia. Didn't matter. They were all there. That said, the only 4 that really had any say in any matter as it related to what was going to happen in the post-Napoleonic world were England, Russia, Prussia to be the future Germany, and Austria. Largely under Austrian leadership, this dude by the name of Prince Clemens von Metternich. In fact, the age in the wake of this Congress of Vienna and Napoleon is known as the Age of Metternich. Gives you some idea of where power is. It's in Austria. But as it relates to this Dancing Congress, it's known as the Dancing Congress because, quite frankly, other than the major 4 powers, and I guess you could throw France in there, Monsieur Talleyrand, as we talk about in the future, as a 5th, aside from those 5, everybody else didn't have anything to do but drink and frickin' dance. Hence the name, the Dancing Congress. And if you were part of the old royalist monarchical system throughout Europe that existed prior to this dude named Napoleon marching across Europe spreading these enlightened liberal ideas, his dismissal from power meant that you could come back to power, and I guess that's pretty good cause to celebrate, yes? Your peeps might not think so in your countries and municipalities, but it's good for you, at least for the time. As we'll see here in a minute, there were 4 guiding principles to this Congress of Vienna, okay? And we'll talk about those briefly and in detail here in a second, but I did want to make mention some important information that is shared on this slide. Congress of Vienna really is important in this regard. It is the first time that Europeans come together to talk about how we can go about establishing and maintaining order. Just think about it. They've been at war, the continent of Europe has been at war for hundreds and hundreds of years, and that's no way to live. So they come together to try to establish certain principles that might be bent towards maintaining long-term peace and stability. And in that regard, it will serve as a blueprint for these international organizations or bodies, for good or ill, depending on how one views them, such as the League of Nations. We'll see that created, spoiler alert, at the end of World War I, and this United Nations, spoiler alert, 2, created at the end of World War II. So the Congress of Vienna really is sort of the taproot of this League of Nations and United Nations that we might know of from an historical standpoint or from the present day. So pretty impactful in that regard especially. So what about these four guiding principles? Well, we'll take them in detail here, and we'll start with the first one listed on this slide, the principle of legitimacy. This one simply meant that those individuals that were on different thrones, had control or power prior to Napoleon's rise, those family lines would be restored to power. That's the principle of legitimacy. They were the legitimate rulers. They will be put back in charge. A good example of this is in France. When Louis XVI lost his head, Napoleon eventually comes to power. When Napoleon's sent to Elba, the folks at Vienna say, well, the Bourbon family, which was Louis XVI, was in charge. We'll put another Bourbon family member on the throne. And they'll do that in the form of Louis XVIII. Whether or not that makes good sense, I leave that up to you to decide, okay? But legitimate family rulers will be put back into position, period. The second principle, pretty simple. It's compensation. You guys have all heard the old expression, to the victor go the spoils. If you are on the victorious side, guess what? You're going to gain some territory. You just are. And keep this one in mind, because the Italians under Piedmont, Sardinia, we're going to talk about that in part 3, they're going to be really damn good at picking the right side to be on in a series of wars, and it's going to help them immensely. We'll see that. The third principle has to do with the balance of power, listed here. What Metternich, Tsar Alexander, Lord Castlereagh, and von Hardenberg had in mind here was the idea that if we can make all European states approximately the same size from a geographic standpoint, because technology is largely the same throughout Europe, and if the size of European states are largely the same, this might serve as a deterrent from any one state looking to go and invade their neighbor. So the notion that they're going to have a balance of power is that we're going to try to equalize out power throughout Europe so that no one state has an advantage over another and therefore may not ever want to invade their neighbor. The fourth principle, this principle of intervention or collective security, this one was a little bit more theory than it was more concrete. And Great Britain or England here was not really on board with this one. They weren't really crazy about this one. And they weren't really crazy about it simply because this principle of collective security said, look, if there is a disturbance anywhere in Europe, we four nations reserve the right to go ahead and march in anywhere and put this uprising down. Well, think about that for a minute. So if there's an uprising in Paris, what, any Austrian or Russian can march into France and put down a perceived threat or uprising? England says, wait a minute, hell no. I mean, that's the right of the French government, the French people to regulate their own domestic affairs. So one of the problems associated with this fourth principle, or principle of collective security, was how do you determine what's a threat? And as a result of that, the English will back away from this one. So of these four principles, the principle of legitimacy, compensation, balance of power, and collective security, what's the impact of these four? What's the impact of trying to turn back the hands of time? And sorry, that's exactly what this was. The reestablishment of conservative order, this age of Metternich, this return to legitimate family lines. What's the impact of that? Not just on order and stability throughout Europe, but the people themselves in the several European countries. Because these are individuals that had been given certain rights under Napoleon, and now those rights are being taken away from them. As a 9th grader, you could stay out till 2 in the morning, and now under Metternich, as a 12th grader, you have to be home at 9. How are you going to feel about that? Probably a big WTF, right? So that is part of the impact. Yet the larger impact as it relates to the Congress of Vienna is actually pretty positive. Europe is spared a large-scale continental war for almost 100 years. This is crazy in relation to European history. Yes, there's going to be a series of smaller-scale wars. We'll see that when we talk about German and Italian unification in Part 3. But it won't be until World War I, 19 and 14, that the continent is fully ablaze again. And in that regard, this age of Metternich, the Congress of Vienna, these principles, they were successful in that regard, to be sure. But from the people's perspective, not so fast, my friends. And we'll move next into the revolutions of 1830 and 1848, because those revolutions are going to have their seeds planted in this age of Metternich and in this Congress of Vienna and in these principles. We'll see that play out next. Rather than try to do some deep granular dive into the revolutions of 1830, known as the Romantic Revolutions as shown here, or those revolutions of 1848, rather I'm just going to give a Cliff Notes version of the two events. Now, this isn't meant to diminish in any way, shape, or form the importance of them, but in the interest of time here, and in the scope of this being a survey course, I'll keep it fairly simple, especially in relation to this age of Metternich and these principles that came out of the Congress of Vienna that helped incite the insurrection that was 1830 and 1848. These revolutions of 1830, they're known as the Romantic Revolutions in part because of this romanticism, this ism that we'll talk about in the next part that begins to gain some traction in the 1800s. It stresses the use of passion and emotion, using the heart as much as the head or the mind. And while these revolutions across Europe, there's not any sort of concerted class action like the lower classes rising up all over the place. That's not the case. All of them do share a commonality in the sense that they are pushing back on the changes that were forced in the wake of the Congress of Vienna. And we'll use two test cases of that briefly here as examples to illustrate how those four guiding principles at Vienna caused uprisings in Europe. We'll start in Belgium. Belgium is going to, as a nation, is going to be born out of these revolutions of 18 and 30. They are. You may recall that the balance of power was one of the provisions at Vienna. Well, the area that will become Belgium was heavily Catholic, had heavy ties with the north of France. And the territories there were given to the Netherlands to create a larger, stronger Netherlands to the north of France. A larger state there in the north then meant to do what? Diminish the likelihood of a French invasion. The problem was the Netherlands was predominantly Protestant. So there's this huge cultural and religious difference between the folks that were, for all intents and purposes, taken away from the north of France and given to the Netherlands. So in 1830, when the opportunity arises, bada bing, bada boom, the Belgian Revolution begins. And by July of 1831, they have a new king, King Leopold, and a new nation. So while the balance of power sought to limit national conflict, they didn't take into consideration the different social and cultural differences, the different ethnic differences of the common people. And as a result of that, you can see how people themselves were going to force change. The case in France is simple. This is a revolt against the principle of legitimacy. Charles X will replace his brother Louis XVIII when Louis XVIII dies. Charles X will look to roll back different rights. He issues these ordinances known as the Ordinances of St. Cloud. You guys can look those up if you want. Basically repealing rights to free speech and that sort of thing. And as a result of that, the people in Paris, they throw up the barricades, and as evidenced very well and articulated very well by Victor Hugo in Les Miserables. Les Mis is set against the backdrop of these revolutions of 1830, not the French Revolution. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, this revolt will be put down, as you all may well know, but it does give us some indication that people are not liking this idea of having absolute kings and absolute monarchs. They want their rights and liberties. They want the ability to express themselves as individuals and rise in social rank according to their own merit, not an old hereditary system. The revolutions of 1848 are largely going to be an extension of the unfinished work from 18 and 30. And while they're not going to be that much more successful than the result of those in 1830, they're going to be put down. In fact, most of the revolutionaries here are going to flee Europe altogether. And they're not going to go to England now like they used to. They keep going all the way to some place called the United States. And as an interesting maybe sidebar for some folks, these revolutionaries that don't like kings, they don't like the old conservative order, they don't like aristocracy, they're going to wind up in blue uniforms fighting against a slave-holding elite, planter elite South. So a little linkage there between the revolutions of 1848 and the American Civil War. But the revolutions of 1848 are going to have one huge impact, especially in Austria. The king there is going to fire Prince Clemens von Metternich. Metternich is gone. The age of Metternich ends. The very symbol of conservative sort of reaction as it relates to these principles of Vienna is gone. And with this age ended, we're going to be looked to start a new one. And it's going to be called the Age of Bismarck. We'll get to that in part 3 when we talk about German unification. Dr. JC out. part 1, lecture 6 here. We'll head next in part 2 to the various isms that emerge in Europe in the 1800s.